What is the most horrifying historical event? Please like and subscribe to support this channel. I don't think it tops some of the other entries here, but World War I, particularly the Battle of Verdun. There was so much rain that guys who fell off the wooden walkways would become trapped in the mud. Soldiers received an instruction sheet on how to put your buddy out of his misery because he couldn't be pulled out. Battle went on non-stop for 10 months. Hundreds of thousands killed to move the line a couple of miles. The strategy had not caught up to the newer, more effective weapons, and it was virtually a stalemate. They could have all played cards for a year and wound up in the same place without so many needless deaths. September 26, 1983. TLDR. New, state-of-the-art, Soviet missile early warning system detected a series of nuclear launches coming from the US heading towards the USSR. The officer in charge that day was Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov. His job was to notify the Soviet government of an incoming US nuclear attack in order to launch an immediate nuclear counterattack. He believed the alarm to be a glitch, and despite resetting the system multiple times, which led to more launches being detected, he never called for a counterattack. He was right, as the satellites the Soviets were using confused the sun reflecting off clouds for a series of American ICBM launches. Had Stanislav, who was called into work that night after a coworker fell ill, called his superiors as standard procedure dictated, a nuclear war would have been triggered. We were basically minutes away from a total nuclear holocaust, as one man held all our lives and the future of the human species in his hands. He was willing to bet the lives of millions of his fellow countrymen and women, and even his own family, on the off chance that the highly advanced system his nation created was wrong. It is almost completely understandable, and in an unsettling way forgivable, that any other person would have called for a counterattack given the extraordinary circumstances and the stress they would have faced. Nuclear bombings of Japan, I would say. The fact that 2/3 of Hiroshima was destroyed is just the outer layer of how fucked this is. The worst part is how the people that was damaged but not killed by the bombs were affected. Imagine being in a microwave oven at 4,000 degrees Celsius with nowhere to hide. That is what it would be like. Your limbs would get turned into a crisp and simply wither off like dust. The skin in your face would melt, covering your mouth and nose, making you unable to breathe. Your clothes would be like being wrapped in a thick coat of flammable wool and then being set on fire, but you can't put the fire out, as it's too damn hot. You have to wait for your entire clothing to burn up before the fire goes out. Some cloth would get stuck in your skin. There are recalls of survivors seeing these so-called four-legged alligator men, from how they looked. They would walk around on all four of their stumps of limbs and moan loudly. They couldn't feel pain, as their nerves would all be long gone. They probably didn't have any hearing left, so you can't tell them, "I am gonna put you of your misery." Most of them would be blind. You can't tell if the alligator man used to be a man or woman, since all of those things would have melted off or be sealed by molten skin. And then there is the fact they don't understand what is happening. Let me paint this picture for you so you can relate. It is a early bright morning, slight overcast. You are on your bike to get to the factory downtown that you have volunteered to work at for the war effort. It is rush hour in your area. As you are waiting for traffic to pass, you look up in the sky. You see a plane. You assume it is Japanese, since no Americans would be flying alone over a city. You then see a black blob drop from the underside of the plane. You start to panic, but you don't move nor say anything. A few seconds pass, and all of a sudden a second sun appears in the sky. But this one is a lot brighter than the real sun. It quickly grows to engulf the entire sky in a bright white ball of fire. Then the wind starts picking up, and in a second you are almost knocked over by the wind, but that is nothing compared to the shockwave. You see buildings be turned into dust that comes flying towards you. You try to run, but you can't. Your hands are stuck on the bike handle. You look down, and realizes your hands have turned a bright pink, and you can see your knuckles through your fist. Then your shirt starts changing color, and then turns black in a second. You look up on the fireball, which has now formed a mushroom-looking cloud several hundred meters high. Your vision then turns dim, and you think you are gonna go unconscious, but you don't. It's just your eyes drying up as the liquid inside them starts to boil. By now the shockwave reaches you, and you are hit by a tsunami wave of debris. You are then thrown thousands of meters and disintegrates into thin air. First, now you get the sweet relief of death. That Henry VIII couldn't simply divorce Anne Boleyn. He had to *kill her in order to be rid of her. See, He'd already gone through so much trouble to divorce Catherine of Aragon, splitting from the Catholic Church in order to do so. He couldn't let people see that he might have been wrong in his convictions and choices, and he'd already destroyed and moved mountains for Anne. It was suggested to him by several advisors that he could simply send Anne to a nunnery, and this might have been his final act of mercy, but instead he had Thomas Cromwell trump up charges that only had death as the consequence. Nobody simply went to jail for high treason against the king, after all. Henry was completely in agreement that Cromwell would do what he had to do to get rid of Anne, even if that meant her death. There was no mercy. He was an actual monster. His daughter Mary I got the false nickname of Bloody Mary. But under Henry's reign, people died for selfish, vain, and false reasons. The Nishapur massacre has to be in this discussion, even if we throw out the oft-quoted impossible number of 1.75 million killed, though we still have a number that is disgustingly high. The condensed version is the Mongols wiped out what was Persia's, maybe the world's, largest city at the time. Their armies killed every man, woman, child and beheaded them, then constructed pyramids with the heads. This pyramid construction phase is said to have taken 10 days. For me personally, the fact it is so unknown, denied, England's oppression of Ireland for over 800 years produced the two most horrifying events. And Gorta Mór, or as some may know it as, Irish potato famine. Ireland lost over 20% of its population in a few years. Oppression of the Irish language. Irish men and women not allowed to use the national language under threats of torture and death, literally pushing the language to near extinction. The Rwandan genocide in 1994, Hutsis versus Tutsis. Take the rape of Nanking and multiply by a country. The first-hand accounts are absolutely gruesome. Gang rapes. Raping babies with machetes, raping women with machetes. Forcing family members to rape each other. Forcing fathers at gunpoint to rape their daughters, or they would kill the daughters, and then kill the whole family for fun. And then there was a group of men with HIV who took it upon themselves to spread the virus to as many of the opposition's women as possible in order to fully wipe them out. So a literal organized rape campaign to spread HIV. I'm not entirely sure on the numbers, but over 1 million women were raped by these monsters alone and contracted HIV, leading to an entire generation of kids born with HIV, through vertical congenital transmission. Fucking barbaric. Attack of the Dead Men. In 1915, the German army attacked Osijek fortress in current-day Poland with poison gas. Expecting everyone in the fortress was dead, the Germans advanced. What they didn't expect was the remaining Russian soldiers to retaliate. About 60 to 100 dying Russian soldiers counterattacked. These men were coughing up blood and pieces of their own lungs but were somehow still alive. The Germans retreated in shock. Must have been some nightmare fuel level stuff. I think it has to be Rwanda given the context. Human history has always been privy to mass slaughters, genocides, inhumane treatment of thousands and millions of innocent people, rape, pillage, and plunder. But as we progressed and developed modern civilization, we adopted normative behavior that reduced those incidents and increased the punishment for those incidents. We legislated them, began proactively collectively fighting against them, shamed ourselves when we fell short of the goal. You finally saw in Algeria, South Africa, and Vietnam and Cambodia what appeared to be the last gasp of these atrocities, as colonialism gave way to independence and militant annihilation gave way to more subtle economic maneuvering. What happened in Rwanda is historically horrifying not because it was a particularly horrific ethnic cleansing, though it was horrific, but because we allowed something typically associated with the Mongol hordes and Vlad the Impaler to happen at an unprecedented scale in 1994, just 23 years ago. You could make a similar argument for North Korea's humanitarian crisis today. It feels like something out of 19th century India or the Belgian Congo. The Black Plague. Reading The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England really made it hit home how significant this event was. To quote Ian Mortimer, "It shakes society in ever conceivable respect. It destroys large portions of the population and leaves parts of the country completely empty of people. No one can tell really how many people are dying up and down the country. The clerks who compile episcopal registers have the best measure of the scale of mortality. They can at least see how many clergymen are dying. In the Diocese of York and Lincoln, 40% of the benefited clergy die in 1348-9. In Herefordshire, the figure is higher, almost 50%. The peasantry fare little better. Half the population of a manor dying is not unusual. To put these figures in proportion, remember that less than 6% of the adult male population of the UK perish over the whole 4 years of World War I, and the overall mortality figure is just 1.55%. Imagine a disease were to wipe out 40% of the modern population of the UK, more than 25 million people. A visit to the time reminds you, with a sharp shock, of both the reality and the scale of the suffering. When you see women dragging their parents' and children's corpses into ditches, weeping and screaming. When you listen to a man who has buried all 5 of his sons with his own hands and in his distress he tells you that there was no divine service when he did so, that the death bell did not sound, you know that these people have entered into a chasm of grief beyond description. In the fields lie dead and rotting sheep, 5,000 in one field alone according to Henry Knighton. As you look around and see ravens flying through deserted streets, and half-wild pigs and dogs eating the corpses abandoned on the edge of the village, you will see something no historian will ever see. The passing bells are banned by the church, the traditional laments thrown away. Put plague in a category of its own as a cataclysm beyond human understanding. One that hasn't been said here yet, probably not as bad as the Holocaust, but the Irish famine was horrific. 1 million died and another 1 million were forced to leave Ireland, and Ireland's population is still lower now than it was before the famine, 8.4 million in 1841 to 4.7 in 2017. The British could have prevented or lessened the famine but were inactive because they thought the problem would sort itself out, or that God was punishing the Irish, not to mention how it helped English displace Irish culture and strengthen the landlord system. This memorial in Dublin does a good job capturing the hopelessness those people must have felt. Similar famines happened in places such as India under British rule where millions of deaths could have been prevented if the British stepped in. The Sand Creek Massacre, and the Wounded Knee Massacre. I think most Americans don't realize how our country treated the Indians. It was a genocide built on white supremacist ideals. Everyone wants to take down the Confederate monuments, but there's no talk about taking down monuments of the Bluecoats who were responsible for this. Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians, and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice. Colonel John Milton Chivington. King William of Normandy's harrying of the north. After defeating Harold and claiming the crown of England, many of the lords of England refused to submit to his rule, especially in the north. As a result, William subjected the north of England to a massacre of epic proportions. Entire villages were massacred, including women and children. Buildings were razed to the ground, and in a final act of evil, the ground was salted, ensuring that the resistant villages could never be rebuilt. The systematic removal and genocide of the American Indian, especially the eradication of the buffalo as a means to starve the Native Americans to death. The U.S. government, backed by the military, has orders in place to kill all of the buffalo. There was at one point roughly 16 million buffalo on the Great Plains. However, once this time period was over there would only be about 600 left. People largely focus on other groups with talking about historical tragedies. The U.S. is not as clean as we are raised to believe. We tend to romanticize them today, but pirates back in the day were the terrorists of their time. Apart from the usual killing, raping and pillaging, some pirates really pushed the brutality to an 11, burning, disemboweling, slavery, execution games and even a few instances of cannibalism. And remember, the victims were mostly civilians, sailors and merchants, people who don't tend to fight back. Pirating didn't just happen in 17th–18th century Caribbean, as Hollywood tends to focus on, but goes way back to ancient times and occurred all over the world.